Hello, everyone, and welcome to Classical Revolution here on IDAGIO. My name is Rachel Fenlon, and this is my weekly series in which I get the great pleasure of chatting with people in the classical music world about what risk-taking is in classical music, what pushing boundaries means for the genre. Today, I'm joined by Dinuk Wijeratne. Dinuk, a friend of mine and a colleague, is a Juno Award-winning conductor, composer, and pianist. Described as exuberantly creative by the New York Times, his multi-genre work has been featured everywhere from Carnegie Hall to the Berlin Philharmonic, the Boulez Saal, Sri Lanka, the Middle East, to the Kennedy Center, and the Northern Sea Jazz Festival. He writes for orchestras as he does for tabla players, DJs, and opera singers. Dinuk is also a passionate educator, and he is the founding head of composition at the Lunenburg Academy of Music Performance. He also enjoyed a 13-year tenure at the Nova Scotia Symphony Youth Orchestra. It's such a pleasure to have him on the show today. Please welcome Dinuk Wijeratne. Hi, Dinuk.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Very well. It's so wonderful to be with you.
It's so great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Dinuk, I'd love to begin with hearing about your earliest introductions to music, whether there are any particular musical moments that stand out for you as really important.
Well, I was born in Sri Lanka, but I grew up actually in Dubai in the Middle East. My mom's a ballet dancer, and my father plays a mean jazz piano. And they just had a lot of recordings lying around the house, you know. And the funny thing about growing up in Dubai was that, you know, it's a childhood that I wouldn't exchange for anything. It's kind of encapsulated in a little bubble for me in my mind, because it's very, very different now. And that city is always changing. But back then, and, you know, I'm dating myself, it was in the 80s and 90s. And it really was this wonderful melting pot of culture, you know, South Asian culture, Arabic culture, Western culture. And on the flip side, the funny thing is you didn't really have access to a lot of things that, shall we say, musically talented youth would have access to. So for example, if you wanted to be in a youth orchestra, you know, in any G8 country or any country with a sistema, you can do that, right? But you couldn't in Dubai. And if you wanted recordings, it was, you just didn't know where to look. And there was one CD shop, just one. And so when I realized I was getting into music and classical music, I would just go, and there was no one to help me. I just had, I think, one friend of mine, and we would go and we would choose the recordings just based on how good the cover looked. So you know, that's the high level kind of discernment we're talking about, right? But what will always linger in my mind is this memory of hearing this Mozart piano concerto number 21 when I was 12 years old. And by this time, you know, I had played some mridangam, which is like a South Indian percussion instrument. I think I'd started to learn piano from Western classical music, and I wasn't super into it. And then I suddenly heard this Mozart, and I remember thinking, this is like the best thing since sliced bread. Like, whatever this is, I want to become closer to it. And it was just totally random exposure, because no one in that environment was saying you should be listening to this or you should be listening to that, which I think now is a big advantage.
Wow. And yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And kind of what was the path through that? I mean, so you moved to Canada at some point and then took a traditional training path?
Yes, and again, in Dubai, you know, you couldn't pursue higher education at a university, particularly if you wanted to do music. So when we were graduating at 18, you know, it was understood that we would either go to the UK or to the US. And I got into a few music colleges in both countries, but I ended up going to the UK because I knew more people there and had a wonderful undergrad at the Royal Northern College of Music. It was just fabulous in Manchester. And I was there for 5 years. Then I left for New York's Juilliard School, stayed in New York to study conducting and Manus. And then I moved to Canada. So I kept moving westwards.
Yeah, okay. And I was so curious because, I mean, I know you as a friend and I know you as a colleague, but there's so many parts of your of your story that I don't know. And I realized, what was it that made you really want to study composition? Where did that impulse first come from for you?
I think, again, very much at the age of 12. I was playing piano and I enjoyed the piano. Um, but I think there was always this drive to create music from scratch. I found that fascinating. And I think when I was an undergrad, I realized that the opposite side to the same coin of composition is improvisation. And I really yearned to improvise and understand what that science and art was about, but I had no one to um, teach me. So, and in a classical college, there were these kind of after school jazz get-togethers, and led by a fantastic musician. And so we would go and learn how to improvise with no kind of, shall we say, degree-based system. It was just, just something that evolved. And so it really was a wonderful sort of organic melting pot of disciplines that just started to coalesce.
Mm-hmm. I definitely wanted to talk to you about improvisation, particularly because of a recent conversation that we had about sort of that kind of lack of evolution of improvisation within classical music. So maybe we can dive into that because I'm curious for you. First, I think it would be really nice for our audience to hear a little bit about what we talked about, which is that, we sort of hit a point in classical music where we stopped incorporating improvisation as much, and how that sort of hindered the evolution of classical music in a more natural way. Wondering if you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely. I like to have fun by imagining these, well, just playing out these little thought experiments in my head, particularly about, the classical music industry and how things have evolved in the tradition. So historically, let's say in the time of Bach, your average pro-level musician was a performer, a composer, an improviser, and a teacher, and a pedagogue, right? So they were multidisciplined. And I think there's been some kind of division of labor. And I think I always say the first nail in the coffin was I think due to Beethoven's deafness, he didn't improvise the cadenza of the Emperor Concerto. And it's so well written that composers after that thought, aha, well, I can write my own cadenzas now. And so we get ushered into this period where there's much, much more control on the part of the composer. Has its pros and cons, of course. I mean, if you're a composer, who doesn't want more control, right? But I think, we suffered in the sense that improvisation was pushed aside, and then more and more control was exercised. And so you could argue that improvisation really has not been given the platform within classical music. When jazz and global traditions, you think of Indian classical music, I mean, we're talking like 95% improvisation, right? And so here we are, but there's some kind of resurgence now. And I think people are interested in what all of these different skill sets can bring back to the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What could you see it like? I love this idea of a thought experiment, and you kind of got me thinking like this.
Yes, sorry. And if we were to talk about a thought experiment, I mean, here's one. The lack of improvisation has made us more dependent on text and notation, right?
Yeah.
Which has incredible advantages. So let's take a random example. Let's take Brahms Second Symphony, which is a piece that will always be played. And we have this text, which is sacrosanct. But what if instead of reading off notation, let's say like a different global tradition, the music was handed down from teacher to student, orally and orally. We would have people sitting on stage with no music in front of them, playing some kind of version of Brahms 2, which is a picture of a picture of a picture from the 19th century, right? I mean, of course, we wouldn't want that, but it makes you think of some very, very interesting departures in terms of how evolution in the classical music industry could have happened, with a bit of improvisation and things that evolve when it's passed down naturally from teacher to student. It's kind of cool to think about it.
Oh, it's totally, I thought about it so much since our last conversation about it. As a composer, do you feel, well, I mean, as a composer and performer, because you kind of do it all, do you feel like you incorporate that more into your work, more and more, or what's that balance like for you?
That's an interesting question, because typically my projects will feature, depending on the nature of the project, they will feature either non-improvisers or improvisers. So I'll give you an example. My piano trio has absolutely no improvisation in it, required of it, but there are 3 cadenzas which are deliberately written to sound as though they were improvised. And I think, every artist has a list of key preoccupations. And apart from the meeting of cultures, which is huge for me, I would say looking at the world through some kind of lens of this dichotomy between what is spontaneous and what is premeditated, I find that endlessly fascinating, because, today you may have some questions prepared, but right now we're improvising, right? So as you navigate through life, there is this wonderful dichotomy of freedom and limits. Freedom and limits, that is so fundamental to every human being. And I think the way you can explore that in music is just so fascinating.
Wow. Yeah.
It's a whole other talk. Yeah.
No, it's exactly, it's freedom and limits is such a succinct way of putting it.
I think it's a paradox, just like all the other the great dichotomies we have in music, like tradition and innovation is a paradox. And if you see it any other way, I don't think it would be accurate, because particularly in the classical music industry, we respect tradition. We know that we're standing on the shoulders of great performances and great creations. But if we want to innovate and be creative, we have to have a healthy sense of rebellion.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't put it in some kind of hermetically sealed bubble. And I think the biggest mistake is imagining that the tradition was always a fixed point, which it never was. It was always in motion. All of the artists we admire were figuring things out. They were constantly in motion. It's only anachronistically do we tend to see things as a fixed point.
Yeah. For you personally, what would you say the challenges are in negotiating that paradox then, with tradition and innovation, or with freedom and limitations? How do you,
I speak to a lot of artists about this in many capacities. Whenever I talk to my colleagues, I love talking about this kind of thing. I also started a consultancy for artists during the pandemic. And so I've been talking to a lot of young artists and mid-career artists who, let's say, have hit some kind of crisis point. And I think if there's some kind of common denominator, a lot of the conversations are about authenticity. How can I be myself? And because a lot of these artists are classical, in the classical music industry, I think we're all either wanting some kind of permission to do something, or we're trying to navigate through this definition of what tradition is, and I should say that, post all the great social movements of 2020, like Black Lives Matter and everything, I'd like to think that things are going in a healthy direction in terms of people feeling that they can be even more themselves, making a bit more room. But to get back to your question, it seems to be this question of how can I be authentic in some kind of tradition where, you know what it's like, it tends to split up into certain factions, and this faction will say, do it like this, and that faction will say, do it like this, and composition is no different to anything, pick it, but, Baroque performance or anything. And it takes a lot of courage, I think, to navigate through that. And just try to figure out if you are giving yourself the permission to do that. My opinion is, I think this canvas, this medium that we're in, is just broad, is plenty broad enough for anyone to tell their story, you know. And I've been lucky to tell mine.
What's particularly unique about you and what you do and what you write is that you have this ability to fuse this sort of East meets West kind of concept or meeting of cultural genres. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what that experience has been like and how that's evolved for you, what the first sort of meeting point of that was. You know, was there a particular, very traditional situation? I know you wrote this amazing tabla concerto, for example. Yeah, I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like for you.
I can use the tabla concerto as an example because it's probably my most popular piece and most performed, and you know, it's performed at least twice a year still. And I had no idea that would be the case. I think there are 5 tabla players who now have it in their repertoire, you know, and this is when they're playing with Western orchestras, right? So even these performers never thought, some of them never thought they'd be sitting on a Western stage with 80 people behind them or whatever. And the biggest lesson I learned from that piece was how much effort it takes to really strike a balance if you really believe that a balance is important. And I'm talking about a respectful balance, right? So, you know, in any creative situation, if you're putting influences together, let's say you've got 2 influences, let's keep it simple, A and B. The first pass at it tips more one side than the other. So you just think, okay, A, I've showcased A, and then you step back and you realize, well, influence B is a little shortchanged, right? So then you go, okay, I'll take another pass at it. And of course, wouldn't you know it, it tips the other way, right? And so that's to say that the first 2 iterations or the first 2 passes at some kind of solution where you're trying to create this balance are easy. But to get to that 3rd solution, or in my case, unfortunately, it's always the 9th or the 10th or the 15th or whatever, right? Requires so much work and deep listening and empathy to find some kind of environment in which the 2 influences or the 3 influences are sort of coexisting in some kind of a respectful way, where neither is shortchanged, you know. And so if there's any successful music in that piece, it was a result of a lot of, you know, I'm looking for a metaphor, but you're trying to sort of take that spirit level and really put the bubble right in the middle, you know. And it taught me so much about life in that sense, you know, because even if you're having a dialogue with someone and you don't understand the other person, if they're from a different cultural background or they have a completely different identity to yours, you know, how much do we strive for that kind of 3rd solution, you know, scenario where we can really find the balance, you know? And so in the larger picture of my work, it's just been such a blessing to have projects where you can just keep trying to do this with amazing musicians from all over the place. It really forces you to, I think every day, if the work you do is an exercise in balance, it really does a lot for you, you know, as an artist, as a human.
You talk about you have performers, like a tabla performer or tabla player performing with an 80-piece orchestra. And do you ever have a situation where it's not the reverse, but for example, I know your work is performed a lot in Europe and in North America. And have you had the experience where you kind of bring the classical music or a Western tradition to like the Middle East or to Sri Lanka, and what has that experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you know, in the, for instance, in Sri Lanka, they have a lot of Western classical music performed in completely, you know, it'll be as though you're going to a Western classical concert. anywhere else. So to be honest, it's more, I find myself more in situations where I'm trying to introduce a non-Western element into a Western environment, you know.
Yeah.
And with the tabla concerto, you know, another kind of fun thing is that the tabla players typically don't read any music, right? And with one tabla player, I remember I was teaching him the tabla part, like composition by composition, and like each one being about 30 seconds. And you can speak these, you know, phonologically, you know, I was just doing that very slowly on a Skype connection with a 12-hour time difference, you know. And so it just kind of gives you this idea of how sometimes almost insurmountable these logistical problems are. You know, then that's where you realize you take notation for granted.
Yes.
As much as you want to throw it out, you just realize, oh my gosh, my kingdom for some notation.
Oh, yeah, I think it's really, really amazing what you do. And for everyone who's listening, you should also, we have you as a profile on IDAGIO, and there's some of your work there. So definitely listen to it. It's really special. I'm curious for you as an artist, how important do you feel that there's a sort of social responsibility as an artist? And if so, how does that sort of manifest for you creatively?
Gosh, I mean, I wouldn't call myself, I think I'm a very socially conscious person, but I think if you look at my work, maybe I don't wear that on my sleeve. I don't make any political or big social statements on social media and that kind of, that's just a personal choice. But I think my strong opinions would be in this, shall we say, this is the philosophy. I think that, you know, first you begin with yourself and whether you're true to yourself. And I think self-awareness as an artist is the first key to authenticity. And I think, you know, if you decide to be an artist, you accept that it's a very naked, vulnerable thing. And then, you know, you have to have the courage to be authentic and just wear that, right? And I think the key to understanding yourself, so for instance, you know, it's taken me a while to sort of understand my preoccupations. How do I see the world? How does my art reflect that? And I believe in those things. So I think you begin with that, and then everything moves outwards in concentric circles. So here I am, I'm trying to be authentic. I'm trying to represent myself. And then, you know, there's my wife, there's the person who's closest to me, there's my friends, my family, and now we're thinking about shared value systems. And then the next concentric circle is your community. Let's say you lead an orchestra, for instance. And then, shall we say, what shall we call them? The anonymous community you don't know, which is the society, right? And so that's the broadest concentric circle. And I think, I guess I seem to think in those terms, like everything moves outwards, but your first response, so in a sense, you can't really serve the larger community artistically as an artist if you don't take care of the first concentric circle, which is just you.
Yeah.
You know, and thank God that we have music as a vehicle that it allows you to discover yourself so deeply.
Exactly. That's such an interesting way of looking at it. I've actually never thought of that. Like I've never thought in such in this sort of kind of going outwards way.
Yeah, and I think, you know, maybe I'm biased as a musician, but I mean, it really is, isn't it? Like possibly the best medium. You know, that you know, that you just in creating something, it just forces you to balance so many different aspects of being human. You really have to, you know, to just try and get it right. And you could just even discuss one of them, just the whole freedom and limits thing. Particularly in, you know, when it's such a big sort of talking point in society now, just to create one phrase with the balance of freedom and limits, that's a great little exercise.
Oh yeah. I mean, here's another one in terms of balance. I mean, how do you sort of balance your own voice that you have as a composer, and any sort of integrating any new influences, integrating any new material?
Well, I think, no artist exists in isolation. I don't believe that they do. As much as you could even try to do it, it's impossible. So
Mhm.
I think better to learn to steal like an artist, as the saying goes. And and what I mean by that is, how do you stay open-minded to all of the influences that are bombarding you, right? And just like going back to my childhood, like I only started emailing people in my undergrad, right? Again, I'm
Mhm.
dating myself, but I'm kind of um, grateful that I do know what a different kind of existence was, where
Mhm.
if you wanted something, you really had to really imagine what that was, and then you'd have to go out looking for it. And now the absolute reverse is true. Like, you risk being bombarded by every kind of influence simultaneously, right? And so what do we need now? We need a better kind of filtration system according to our own rubric of what we want to be as artists, right? So if I have an idea of how I'd like to develop myself, then I have to really carefully curate the stuff that's coming in, be discerning, and then find a way to pull them together. But I think it's so much more fun being, I think, eclectic in that way than saying, okay, I'm going to shut you all out, I'm going to develop by myself. I just don't think it happens like that.
And like you say, it's not actually possible. So even
I
if
don't think so.
you think, here's another question that is just coming out of what from what you're saying is, do you have a sort of set of core values as a composer, or core things that when you talk about your vision, and staying true to that, do you have sort of a criteria or a list or a?
I do very much, actually, because I'm also a big fan of psychology and self-help and stuff, and I think that every human, they say, has a set of values, right, that dictates how they function and how they look at the world. And for artists, it's no different. If you um, if I was to mention the name of a favorite artist of yours, let's say I took three of them, uh, and let's say I mixed in a name of someone who you were completely ambivalent to. Don't worry, I won't do this live. I won't do this live.
You know a lot of the ones I like and don't like.
So I list these people. For the people that you just adore, you'll have an emotional reaction,
Yeah.
right? It won't be just the sound of their name. It'll be this kind of like big package reaction where you just kind of resonate with their value system, right? And I mean, I've got a signed photo of Claudio Bardo on the other wall, right?
Yeah.
And hands down, he's my favorite conductor, and I have many favorite conductors. But it with an artist like that, it's you resonate with a certain value system, which ends up manifesting in the sound and then in the work, right? So I think the more you can be conscious of this, the clearer you can be. And that's what I love, talking about with other artists and asking young artists this. And in my case, in this life, the way it's gone, I'm fascinated by the meeting of cultures. I'm fascinated by, I guess the metaphor for that is, when different identities come together and commingle, how do they find that third space, right?
Yeah.
And then getting back to this composition improvisation coin with the two sides, I think the metaphor for that, as we've said, is this notion of freedom and structure.
Yeah.
It's something that is permanently a part of your life, and I just love to see how people are solving problems based on that in any industry. Like there are all kinds of parameters, but then they can enjoy some freedom. I'm also fascinated by, I think, tradition and innovation in any industry, and in classical music, it's a big talking point, of course. Those three things, I think, really keep me busy, and so I would say the words balance and synthesis are very epic words for me. Like I think we have different definitions of what music is, but for me, it would be you know, music allows you to find a sense of balance that I think eludes you otherwise in daily life. And I think that's why we love it so much. Like if, you know, if I just disappear into my own world for 5 minutes while I'm playing something, or if I can create that elusive, perfect object that every composer is trying to create, just for that time, you've created some balance that you can't really find, you know, otherwise.
Well, when you're saying all of this, it makes me think that in a way, music is also that third thing in the room, that third person, because it's you and the experiences you're having, or the world at large. And then, like you say, this respite, or this other thing that comes from that. I like this idea of playing with these different dimensions, or that third kind of element.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and you talk about music being its own character, right? You know, it just reminds me of that amazing film Amadeus, and how you know, Milos Forman said, you know, I want the music to be its own character, right?
Yes.
You're creating, you know, not just the characters you see visually, but I think all of us as composers, we're trying to create these perfect objects, and if we get it right, they just become their own people somehow, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I feel that I'm not a composer. I'm really an interpreter, and I even feel that way with just some hours with Schubert. Then you're, in a way, you're creating space for something else.
No, but do you know, do your viewers know that you're also a composer too? Can I like out you publicly?
Well, I think you just did.
I did. I'm going to say it for all your viewers. My goal is to get Rachel to get her songs out too.
Oh.
Anyway, that's been documented now.
Okay.
It's getting hot in here.
It's getting hot in here. We're running out of time. No, I'm just kidding. When I was thinking about the things I wanted to kind of chat and pick your brain about today, another thing I'm really curious about to hear are your thoughts about this exact current time, and what your takeaways have been so far during this pandemic time, and particularly what it is to be an artist right now, where a lot of what we do, or the kind of end result of what we do, actually is the thing that puts everyone at risk, and we can't do it. So I guess a more specific question would be, what do you feel we as artists right now can do? How can we react to this time?
I mean, it's been a difficult time because, you know, we rely on gatherings, and we like people being all bunched up really close in a concert hall. Really, you know, I love that intensity. And of course we can't have that. If there's been one benefit, I think it's given us some time at home to think about what we want to do, our goals, our values as artists, you know, ask and answer these bigger questions. And also I've been seeing this time through the lens of, you know, this notion of creativity and innovation in this industry, right, compared to other industries. Because we can't just look at our own. And I think, you know, as you've seen, orchestras around the world have been scrambling to get digital content out, right? So maybe, you know, as difficult as it has been, maybe we needed this kick in the pants, you know, where we, you know, we have to embrace new technologies and really get new kinds of content out. Again, there are pros and cons to every medium, but I think that has been good. And then I think the social movements last year were also very good for us because, again, it's been another much needed kick in the pants. You know, if like when the next version of this iPhone comes out, I expect it to be better than the last, right? And so why should innovation in any industry be any different, right? We should really ask ourselves, how are the systems, how is the next iteration of the system going to be better than the last? Here's another thought experiment. I mean, a symphony orchestra model that has non-Western instruments in it, that has even different classical instruments than we're used to, maybe saxophones or accordions, you know, they're beautiful colors, just, you know, even integrated into the wind section, for instance, you know, But none of this has happened. None of this is standard. So you could say that there has been some kind of stagnation in terms of innovation in certain pockets of the industry. And I think that needs to be addressed, you know.
Yeah, right. And we're sort of forced, I mean, technologically at least, we're forced to that right now. Yes. But I think you're absolutely right with also the time to reflect. We can kind of also be, I mean, reflection often equals like challenging, at least for me, challenging certain traditions or certain boxes or what have you.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of any kind of cross-disciplinary way of looking at things. That's the best way we learn, you know.
Yeah.
And so we can't keep judging our own industry by only a rubric that the industry creates, right? Which is why I'm using, let's say, the iPhone analogy. If we were, you know, I mean, chefs are constantly coming up with new dishes. So of course we would expect classical composers to do the same, but the, you know, the systems of how the mediums, the various mediums are evolving, we have to look at that too. Yeah. And again, just to use the orchestra as a quick example, you know, if you, for instance, if you look at the evolution of the Western classical orchestra since Monteverdi, between say Monteverdi and Mahler, right, on a graph, it would have this incredible like exponential curve of like innovation, right? And you think of like everything Wagner did for the orchestra and everything. And then, you know, I would argue that maybe from the time it was an established business model in the late 1800s to the year 2020, does the graph look the way it did between Monteverdi and Mahler? I don't think it does, you know. So, you know, and again, I'm using my lens is looking at it from business or science and tech and everything, where people are constantly expecting a new innovation. And that puts a healthy pressure, you know.
For sure. I suppose the only sort of, it's not an argument against it because I completely agree with you. I suppose the factor that comes in is that
is the tradition.
It's more that we tend to innovate or create, or like you use the chef metaphor, which I love using for music anyway, based on demand and based on audience. And I feel that that's the one thing that we kind of struggle with as an industry, is sort of like our audience, you know, always feeling that our audience is getting smaller or that we're becoming less and less relevant, which of course, I mean, you can think about these things or not think about these things. I mean, the truth is that, of course, as a genre, classical music, now we have many different competitors in the music industry, or not competitors, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
I do.
And I think that's perhaps the tricky thing to try and resolve somehow, because that forces us. I mean, you see it in the pop world all the time. There's always new content and always experimentalism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, the mainstream pop world is also not without its problematic limits.
Absolutely.
So I think, you know, what's interesting about the world of pop is that there are subgenres who also feel marginalized, which is fascinating, right?
Yes.
Because they're not mainstream.
Yeah.
You know, sort of like EDM and metal and, you know, all these, and then subgenres of metal, right? Yeah. And it's fascinating. Like in any system, like anything that vaguely resembles some kind of evolving tradition, there will be some kind of marginalization.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
I think it's just the way, I think what we do as humans. So I think, you know, as you say, like you can bemoan the fact that not enough people respond or get classical music. I mean, what makes me jealous is that people will respond more to an experimental film from a cutting edge director, which could become mainstream. But maybe that won't happen to a classical piece, right? Yeah. And maybe it won't happen in my lifetime, but I think then, you know, the other discussion is, how do you change the literacy from the youngest level of society up? Exactly. You know, if there was if it was accepted that understanding sound and how it worked the same way you understand language or mathematics.
Yeah.
If you could, if you could build that in,
yeah.
I think we would be appreciating things in a different way.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's something we've talked about on the show a lot, is sort of that inherent code of music. And that if that was, like you said, more literized, then it's kind of the way forward. I mean, and that also kind of brings me back in a way to the improvisation, because I think also I can't quite connect the thought, but there's this somehow the idea that if we also could incorporate more improvisation and that freedom, it might also be more natural or compelling for people to want to understand more. I don't know. It's just an idea.
It's just one of many things. I'm not for a second trying to force any skill set on anyone.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking, I think the general takeaway could be, could we just loosen any kind of thing that restricts us for whatever reason?
Yeah.
And could we certainly give ourselves the permission to try something a little differently? Yeah. And from talking to a lot of artists of color, one thing I should admit is, like, since the middle of last year, I've been asked to be in a lot of panels for this, that, and the other, right? And I have actually been very lucky and very privileged. I have to admit, there has been no kind of discrimination or anything, certainly to my face. But I know that some of my colleagues have not been so lucky. And so all I'm trying to say to people is, just feel like you can do anything you want. I mean, if you write an orchestral piece, the canvas is totally blank. I really don't think people should feel like it comes with any kind of, preconceived notions or any stipulations. Like, you should feel like the canvas is totally blank. There's enough room to tell your story in this industry, And I'm not, at this point, I'm not just talking about cultural things or ethnic things. Ethnicity, I mean. It can be anything, any sense of identity you have as an individual, as a classical musician, you should be able to wear that with pride.
I love that. Dinuk, thank you. Sorry, no, please.
No. I was just going to say, it's worth asking, I guess, why we don't feel like we have that sometimes,
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose that would also go into what you talked about in the beginning, which is that sort of self-awareness as well, and that that introspection that needs to happen first, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Dinuk, thank you so much for making time today and all of your very inspiring thoughts. And it's been really wonderful to have you here.
The pleasure's mine. So great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to sort of end with my question that I love to ask all the guests, hence the title of the show, Classical Revolution. How do you feel music can be revolutionary?
Gosh, I don't know. People just feeling like they have the ability to be themselves. And the rest of us making room for that. I think if we can get those things right, it'll take care of itself.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dinuk. And thank you everyone for tuning in today.
Thank you, Rachel.